2, 1, action.
All right. Thank you, everyone who's joining us via live stream. Recommended action that the Board of Education leaves executive session at 7:58 p.m. and returns to the work session meeting.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Oppose, abstain, motion carries. All right, before we move into new business, I'm actually going to turn it over to Trustee Anna Teague.
Oh, I just wanted to mention to everybody that YouTube closed captions are available shortly after completion of each meeting live stream. YouTube offers an auto translation of their closed captions in multiple languages. Los subtítulos de la estación de YouTube están disponibles unos momentos después de la finalización de la transmisión en vivo de cada reunión. YouTube ofrece una traducción automática de subtítulos en varios idiomas. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna. And now I will move into new business. Recommended action that the Board of Education approves the resolution to update COVID protocols based on clear metrics as presented.
So moved.
Second.
On the question?
Yeah, I just want to give people a brief background about the resolution. Just want to make sure, can everybody hear me?
Okay.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, I mean, and again, this is a resolution that was put together by Westput, and it is trying to seek guidance from New York State. And so regardless of where you stand on the issue of mask mandates, this is a broad resolution in the sense that it's calling on the state to provide school districts with clear guidance on healthcare protocols, as opposed to leaving the decision of finding the right COVID mitigation strategies to individual districts. So that just a little background for people who, if anybody's curious about it.
Thank you very much, Omar. Yeah.
If I can add, this came in part, or in substantial part, from a meeting that Governor Hochul had with various representatives within the school community, superintendents, PTA president, etc. Our Westput representatives attended as observers, and one of the things that was raised during that discussion, and there subsequently at the Westput town hall meeting that I attended on behalf of the board, was that it was the consensus among the local educators, that for the state to simply say mask mandate from a state level will be basically set aside, and it's up to each district to figure out what they want to do, but the state not providing us with any information or any metrics or anything that could help us make a decision is basically, pushing that decision down to us unfairly. And that's why this resolution, it has been drafted by Westput, and they sent it to us to ask for our support.
Does anyone have any questions? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Oppose, abstain, motion carries. Thank you very much to the advocacy team for working on this, and to Westput for always making sure that they're advocating for what's best for our school districts.
I should add one other thing on that subject. Is one of the other things that Westput provided as resources are template letters for members of the public to give their own statements, however they wish to our legislators and to our leaders in Albany. And I guess one of the things that perhaps we need to do as an advocacy committee is get that material available for members of the public, and figure out how to communicate that to the public so that people can follow through as they desire. That's really a committee role.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up, Neil. I was actually going to ask about the process of sharing the link to those templates with the public. Is that firstly an advocacy committee discussion?
That's first, I think, and in consultation with communications committee, and perhaps also district clerk, and communication specialist, a lot of different things we can do, but now that we have the resolution, we can then go on to the next step.
Okay.
I will note that according to today's newspaper, the governor said that don't expect a statewide change on, the emergency that has been declared has been extended till March 16th. And the governor has also said that sometime probably in early March, there will be a decision coming out as far as any changes in the mask mandate, statewide mask mandate in schools.
Mhm.
So we're kind of, that's why we're saying this now, because in the next couple of weeks, it's going to be something that may be put on our plate.
Thank you very much. All right, well, we'll now move into the main focus of our night tonight, which is the budget work session. So I will turn it over to Superintendent Walker and Ms. Harrington Cohen for our budget presentation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. And it's my pleasure to have an opportunity to spend some time kind of introducing the topic this evening, sharing some of our priorities and some aspects of our vision in terms of how we want to advance the instructional experience, the teaching and learning experience for all of our Tiger students and staff through the budget process. And then I'll hand it over to Denise, who will go through the financial aspect of things. We thought it makes sense every time we talk about the work of the budget to make sure that there's clarity around what our priorities are for our team and for the community. And so while I think most of this language is fairly straightforward, there were a couple that I wanted to highlight. From my perspective, the balance between bullets 3 and bullets 4 is a key part of this process. So the idea that, of course, we want to make sure that we're effective and responsible stewards of the community's money and their funding, and that we need to make sure that we're responsible fiscally in the decisions that we're making. And at the same time, make sure that we're using the budget process to have conversations around how we can advance the teaching and learning experience for all of our students and all of our staff members. So to me, that's really the most enjoyable and inspiring part of the budget process, is when we get a chance to say as a team, as a community, these are the things we'd like to envision and do envision for our students in the next year. And here's how now we can go about a process of making sure that we can fund them and prioritize them, not only for the next year, but into years beyond that. As a brief review, and obviously this team was here on December 2nd and also on January 6th. The 2nd, we saw a preliminary discussion of the budget in terms of timeline, certain priorities and assumptions, both on the revenue and expenditure side of the ledger. On the 6th, there was another somewhat brief update, simply because we didn't have a lot of new information at that point in the budget cycle with regard to pension rates and, again, expenditures and revenues. And so that leads us into this evening where again, I have the opportunity to talk a little bit about our vision for what we'd like to do to advance the instructional and whole child experience for all of our students. And as we think about it in terms of how we communicate this to everyone in our system and out into the community, we're looking at kind of 4 broad themes in this area. The first being that we think about how we can advance and improve the whole child experience, thinking through not just their academic experience, but what they experience in terms of their social and emotional wellness, their physical wellness, their ability to participate in our schools outside of the classroom. And so you'll see some examples tonight of how we plan to continue to prioritize that for every one of our students. We want to spend some time talking about how we're going to further the professional learning opportunities of our faculty and staff members through some new initiatives and new concepts related to that through the budget, that we want to continue as a district to re-envision, modernize our learning environments in continuation of some of the great work that's already happened, including the library here at the high school, and how we're going to go about continuing to use technology to engage and support teaching, learning, and innovation in our schools. And so when we think about, again, that concept of the whole child experience, I want to share kind of some big picture ideas. As you all know, we're relatively early in the process, not only from the financial side, but also from the planning side. And there's a ton of discussion that needs to happen between our principals, our staff, our students, and this team as well, about how some of these ideas will work logistically. And so what we're looking forward to for tonight is giving an overview, and then between now and Budget Saturday, continuing to dig into some of these ideas further, and then using Budget Saturday as an opportunity to really dive deeply into some of these concepts and what they'll look like in our schools. So One of our ideas first is to increase resources related to social and emotional wellness. And so our students, like so many across the nation, are continuing to demonstrate increased needs in these areas. And when we look at student schedules, how often they're spending time with a counselor, we look at the counselor schedules and what they're spending time on, as opposed to what we initially envisioned them to be spending time on. It's clear to us that we need to increase our resource in this area. We have so many counselors who are not getting to kind of the fundamental work in classrooms with broad segments of our students because they're spending so much time dealing with more emergent student issues. And that's not a Croton-Harmon system issue. That's really a nationwide challenge. But we want to be responsive to that here, of course. So a couple of our initial proposals in this area include increasing the school psychologist staffing at PVC. It's currently 1.6 full-time equivalents or FTE. And so we would recommend increasing that to 2, increasing that second position from part-time to full-time. We're also envisioning through this budget adding an additional clinical staff position that would likely be split between multiple schools, depending on the needs as students continue to demonstrate them over the next few months as we look at our schedules and how we can best support students across the board from K to 12. We're envisioning an additional staff member there, likely either a school psychologist or a social worker, depending on, again, discussions within our system over the next few weeks about what we think will best meet the needs of our students. At PVC, we're looking to increase academic intervention services and programming in both ELA and math. That would be actually through a reallocation of the current staff member, and so no new money applied to that, but part of the same vision of making sure that we're supporting students in all aspects of their experience in the system. We want to make sure that we're continuing our commitment to small class sizes, and so we're looking at adding an additional classroom teacher to CET, either to kindergarten or first grade. And Denise will show you shortly an enrollment slide that justifies and helps folks understand why that would be happening. We're going to watch really closely the kindergarten and first grade numbers over the next few months. If they increase even slightly, as they have in the past, that will absolutely require us to add that additional teacher to one of those grades. And from an athletic standpoint, we look forward to proposing that we become part of a shared ice hockey team experience to provide an additional option for some of our student athletes who are not participating in any winter sports now, who have shared with us along with their families that they have a strong interest in this. And so that's a recommendation we'd like to bring to the board at an upcoming meeting in terms of its creation and then funds through the budget process. Another priority, as we've shared it, another theme is that enhancement of the professional learning of faculty and staff, which we know is so important to the ongoing growth and improvement of our system. And so one of the things we're really excited to talk about over the next few weeks and months is the concept of a pedagogical coaching model that we would look to start here at the high school with 2 part-time positions with teachers who would remain embedded in the classroom as teachers for part of the day, and then would spend the rest of the day collaborating with colleagues, creating professional learning opportunities, going into colleagues' classrooms, modeling lessons, supporting new pedagogical approaches, and using their classroom as a fishbowl or a lab site to demonstrate new and innovative teaching techniques and practices for colleagues around the school. So what we're initially envisioning is one within the humanities area and one within the STEM area, with some significant further discussion to occur with Laura, with John, and with the faculty at the high school about how to best utilize that kind of resource. But that's something that would be very new to our system and something that I think will allow us to grow exponentially in terms of the quality of the practices that happen throughout the system. These are multiplier kind of positions. So we're really, really excited about that. Also, in having conversations with teachers and our leaders at CET and with parents as well, one of the things that we've noted is that within our repertoire of literacy practices, particularly at the primary level, we don't have enough multisensory reading trained teachers to allow for students on a broad level to get exposure to that kind of research-based phonic and phonemic awareness, science of reading approach to literacy. And so we'd be looking to devote funds to make sure that over the course of probably 2, maybe 3 years, each of our primary teachers at CET are trained in some multisensory reading approach. Wilson, Norton Gillingham, Preventing Academic Failure are some that are strongly and widely used. And so we look to bring that to CET beginning this summer, hopefully. And also looking at some different curriculum mapping software, some more adaptive, higher quality curriculum mapping software to kind of further the work of the transdisciplinary unit design. We need to have some kind of a software that's responsive to the work that John and principals and the teachers are doing. And so we would recommend including funds for that in the budget as well. From a learning environment perspective, obviously everyone in this room, I believe, has spent time up in the library here, and what a beautiful and inspiring space that is. And so I know that Michael and Lauren and the team are very much looking forward to the opportunity to rethink what the PVC library can look like in terms of being a truly engaging and modernized learning space for kids. So we'd look to include funds to allow that to happen. In addition to rethinking and modernizing and innovating within certain classroom spaces throughout the district for teachers who have shown that they understand how that's going to change their classroom instruction and truly allow for more collaborative and cooperative work. So we look to allocate some funds for that as well as implementation of software for some of the interactive displays. So as we make a change from smartboard displays to more flat panel displays, there are a lot of new technologies in terms of the back end software that allow kids and teachers to utilize that better, more effectively in the classroom. And so that's a priority for us as well in terms of the learning environments. And additionally, enhancing or engaging technology to support the teaching, learning, and innovation process. So a couple here that I want to highlight. Of course, we want to continue to supply new devices to certain grade levels to support the one-to-one device program that's already in place throughout the district. Continue to make that transition, as I said, from the projector and smartboard based classroom to more of a flat screen technology based classroom, and continued customization of Infinite Campus, our student information system, particularly as we talk about instructional priorities around response to intervention and tracking student data and response to certain instructional interventions over time. There are aspects of Infinite Campus that can do that for us, but of course there's a financial aspect to that. So we want to include money in the budget to allow for that. And so just to kind of summarize from the staffing perspective, these are things that, again, we're very, very excited about, and we know are directly targeted to improve the experience for students and teachers. So one full-time equivalent, or FTE is the acronym we use in education, either a school psychologist or a social worker, again, likely shared between schools. One FTE elementary teacher at CET, of course, 2 part-time or 0.6 pedagogical coaches here at the high school. An additional aide at CET, that would be corresponding with, if we had an additional kindergarten section, we would apply an aide to that classroom. And increasing, as I talked briefly about, that current part-time school psychologist position to full-time at PVC. And I'm now happy to turn it over to Denise, who's going to talk a little bit about the executive budget.
When do you want questions?
One question.
Whatever works best for the team. We're happy to answer during or after the presentation, or both.
I think now might be a good time to stop for this,
Yeah.
for this one, if you don't mind. So you mentioned in the item on provide targeted learning supports to students, increase academic intervention services in ELA and math at PVC, that this was going to be FTE neutral.
Correct.
Where is it coming from?
Yeah, I believe it's the decrease in the number of FTEs in the incoming 7th grade. That the enrollment doesn't require that additional teacher at 7th grade. And we would then apply that to increasing the intervention services that are really needed for our students there.
Got it. Okay.
Can I just ask, would that be something that would continue year to year then in that position, or is that just a 1 year?
That's our intent. Yes, is to have it continue that way. Yeah, we're really under resourced in that area in PVC right now.
So, couple of questions. The first, and an observation. The first is, when you're talking about adding 2 part-time 0.6 FTE pedagogical coaches at the high school, which said is that teaching 2 sections and then spending the rest of the day in the coaching activities,
Yeah.
which we've talked about before. Are you talking about how is that going to work if Are we increasing staff by hiring 2.6 FTEs because of the load? Or you're hiring, proposing hiring 2 full-time FTEs, and therefore you're going to have 4 more sections during the day for teaching? Or is that neutral, which means that we're taking away a certain number of slots of classroom teaching?
Right. Let me answer generally because I want to allow Laura to have some of those conversations within the building, but what we're envisioning is that it would be section neutral in terms of we're not going to be adding or decreasing any of the student opportunities in terms of electives or any of the sections that we currently offer. So more than likely what we'll see is postings for part-time teachers or if we have a current part-time teacher position that we can increase to full-time to make up for that gap of 0.6, we will likely end up doing both, I think.
Okay, I mean, I think that would have some certain budgetary discussions, because obviously if you hire a 0.6, you're hiring somebody who is under collective bargaining agreement, gets benefits, et cetera, as opposed to 0.4, but okay.
Yeah, and you'll see there are funds in the budget as it exists right now for that to happen.
Second question or area of discussion is in the discussion on facilities and technology, but in particular facilities. Select classrooms and other spaces to change it in the environment. I know we, as the board knows, public probably knows, we are looking at the engagement of an architect, engineer, 5-year plans, building condition survey, et cetera, on the facility side. How are we going to dovetail what's going to be done by those professionals? Because I know that there's a lot of ideas out there with the concept in 2022-23 of doing this work, because I don't want to do work that kind of doesn't fit in an overall vision of our facilities, and I don't want to delay doing things if it does fit within the vision. So how do you see that?
So the difference in my mind, and I think we see it here already, is we wouldn't engage the architectural firm unless we were talking about the redesign of the footprint of the learning space. When we're talking about changing furniture, modernizing that kind of environment, to change from the more classic desks and rows to furniture that is more mobile, that we don't need an architect for. And you'll see that in some spaces in this building already. So that kind of redesign, we believe, and we know we've shown it already, have the internal capacity to design and do ourselves.
So you also mentioned PVC library space, which, while it was built, what, 15, 16 years ago, 17 years ago, it is still traditional, if you will, in terms of how it's laid out for books, as opposed to the kind of learning spaces and collaborative spaces we see in the high school. Is for 2022, 2023, what is envisioned there? Because that's really something that I think may involve more of the kind of work that the architects and the longer range planning, and perhaps more cost, will, would lend itself to.
Yeah. I know Michael is extremely excited to share some of these thoughts with the board, so I'm going to I'll give him time to do that, and we'll
That's
talk
gonna
about
be
it
on
on budget
budget
Saturday, if
Saturday.
that's okay. Yeah.
Anna?
I just have a question about the hockey team. Is that a boys team, or is it a boys team and a girls team? How does that, I don't know hockey.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not sure, as I sit here today, I know the answer to whether or not there are any female students on that team. It's a team that exists now.
Right.
That's a combination of several other local districts that we'd be joining. I don't know the roster now to know whether or not there are any female players on the team.
To just add, I think from reading the sports section, there are some interscholastic Westchester hockey teams that do have girls playing on those teams,
Yeah.
but it's not like there's two, there's a boys league and a girls league.
Right.
But the question
Yeah.
as to whether a girl who is interested in playing hockey at, the high school level could try out and do it. So, the rules are in general
Mhm.
that if there's a girl, we've had girls play on a football team
Mhm.
years past. There are issues that come up sometimes with boys playing on volleyball when there's not a boys volleyball team, but that's, once again, that is where there is not only one team, not separated between boys and girls, there is a right to, across.
I just
So-
don't know enough about the roster to know if there are any female players on the team now.
Right. Thank you.
So I'll just piggyback on that, because my son does play hockey. But I'm not aware of a public high school girls hockey program. There might be. So it is something you may want to look into because boys hockey and girls hockey are totally different. And so if we have a female athlete that, if we're going to go down the path of hockey,
Mhm.
we should make sure that we're not going into an area where we will be limiting the options for our female athletes. Okay, so.
Yeah, that's a great point.
And there's we'll have the discussion about whether it's something we should be doing or not at a different day.
Yep.
But I was just gonna say, Denise, I'm gonna wait for your presentation, but I think you probably can guess a lot of the questions that I'm gonna have. But I'm gonna just lay the overall arching theme for me is, I come at this, Steve, just so you know, looking at it from the impact to the taxpayer. I'm always very leery of creating a budget that reaches too far into the pockets of the taxpayers if we don't
Mhm.
have to,
Agreed.
or not necessarily have to, but without a strategic plan in terms of pacing it. So the questions that came to my mind, because there were a lot of adds into this budget where we're suddenly growing.
Mhm.
One, is it sustainable? Two, are we taking something away to bring something in so that we stay at a relatively level cost? Because adding all of these positions, it's not just the salary, it's other parts to it. And the worst thing to do is to bring in a position this year because the budget may be a little bit more flush because of funds coming in. And then in 2 years, have to hike it up on these taxpayers to keep us at that level. That really does concern me. And then secondly, I know we have the demographic study, and I know you mentioned to it, Steve. I didn't see it as projecting Croton as growing in terms of class sizes. So I'm just a little curious as to how the increase in staffing connects to that demographic study, or if we're going to be, or if there's some nuances there that I've forgotten about, which is highly possible. Ice hockey, I'll wait to hear from on Budget Saturday. And then I similar with the concerns that Neil was raising, I also had a question because I know you mentioned that a lot of it might be furniture and stuff. If I recall, the architects were involved actually with us when we were looking at the furniture to make sure that the vision that they were putting forward was also going to mesh. So that was like not a hodgepodge kind of thing. And so that furniture that was brought in, you won't be discarding it later because it no longer fits into the space. So I would just also put that out there on the radar that in talking about redesigning and things like that, it's vital not to go, because I remember when we bought these smart boards, they weren't that long ago. And now we're talking about moving on to a totally different type of technology and expenditure. And I would rather, I know technology changes, but I'd rather not constantly be laying out this large amount of money if we're gonna be moving away from it. So those are the overall,
Yep.
as Denise goes forward.
And again, Denise will be sharing shortly one of the enrollment slide, but the number that we're using comes from that demographic study that shows that we're looking at 130 incoming kindergarten students, which is a substantial increase over where we are and where we have been. So, but as I understand it, that demography study has been fairly accurate year over year. And so that's what we're using to base the current projections on.
Right, now I was just talking like in terms of long-term sustainability, if we bring in a new staff member and then it drops off quickly,
Yeah.
we can't tell that
Yeah.
staff member, thank you, right?
Sure.
So we
Yeah.
want to make sure
Yeah.
that.
And so we also look at then the trajectory of our staff in general and what we can project in terms of retirements going
Mhm.
forward over the next few years. And if, to the extent we need to make decreases in staffing, we want to, of course, do that through attrition.
Okay,
And then there are also, I think, conversations to be had about that, again, the kind of coaching model where that isn't necessarily directly related to enrollment in either direction, but is about improving the system and allowing us to improve kind of the learning culture of the schools and the experience of all the students. So I agree, we want to be strategic when we do that. And I think in doing it in a part-time way, allowing teachers to maintain a footing in the classroom,
Mhm.
and still that presence in the rest of the day in other classrooms, from my perspective, makes sense and is sustainable. And I think you'll see that the tax levy, as we sit here today, is within the realm of what it has been. And that's one, of course, one of the key metrics that I would look at.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a comment, I guess. First, want to say thank you for putting this together. This is really clear, kind of a story of what it is that we're trying to achieve in this upcoming budget, and I really think you're addressing the right focus in the right areas. I think one thing that, and this may tie into the comment Iris made, it'd be helpful to have some metric to the extent possible that would look at the cost of an initiative that you're proposing to put forward as a percentage of the number of students it is serving, right? And I think that would help, so is the wrong word, but it would help convey to the public how their tax dollars are impacting the school.
Thank you, Omar. I think one of the interesting aspects of that is that we would argue that over time, the denominator there is going to be every student in this building. And so that's what's exciting for us about that concept, is kind of the rising tide lifts all boats.
Yeah.
I agree with you in terms of how do we assess that, right? Is it partially through school culture surveys, climate, student performance? I think there are a lot of ways to think about that. And we can give some thought to how we can establish a metric now to the potential impact of investing in this over the course of time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Put that together.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, so I am going to go over briefly the executive budget, followed by enrollment. Then we'll look at some revenue projections with regard to our state aid, tax cap, fund balance and reserve. And then Superintendent Walker is going to close us out with an overview. And more of the good stuff. More of the exciting
It's
stuff.
all good stuff. It's all
Right,
good.
right. So a brief overview of the executive budget. Clearly a very different approach in budget strategy between the two governors. I'm ashamed to say who I align with more, but this is, in all of my years, this is the most aggressive first out budget that I've seen as far as generosity. As you recall, in our previous administration, it was haggling for a couple of months, and then at the 11th hour, he would come through with some funds where she kind of just stepped out and gave a very generous budget recommendation. So part of that recommendation is full implementation of foundation aid and equitable distribution. She has removed the expense-based aid formula consolidation effort, which was to cap all of our expense-based aids. There is $100 million over 2 years for mental health grants. The potential subsidization of the free and reduced meals by the state. So currently, the federal government is subsidizing the free and reduced meals. Croton Harmon is participating in that waiver. We're one of the few districts in the county that have participated. So I believe that the state is looking to subsidize that should the federal government not for the subsequent year. There's an initiative to have all school bus purchases be electric by 2027. That's a very enthusiastic approach. Also, the suspension of the retiree earning limits, the income waiver, what that would do is it would allow retirees to earn over the current max, which is I believe it's $35,000. So that would bring in additional sub teachers, bus drivers, et cetera, because they would not hit that cap. So that's a very positive recommendation. And then lastly, she is proposing to increase the undesignated fund balance at the state level to, I think the number is 15%, to allow for fiscal stability at the state level. And our hope is that if it's done at the state level, then that will be considered for school districts as well, where we currently have a 4% fund balance allowance. So here we go to our enrollment slide. As you know, enrollment dictates a majority of our budgetary decisions, especially in the area of facilities and staffing needs. So I'm going to help you navigate this very busy slide. I'm going to ask you to call your attention to the top half, the yellow section of the slide, and we'll go column by column. So the first column is the grade level. The second is the number of students. The third is those are our special education students that are being serviced in a resource room. And then the next is the total. The next section is the number of sections in each grade level. And the orange indicates what we're looking for 22-23. And then the following section are the class guidelines that the district has implemented over the years. It's up to 22 from grades kindergarten through second, and then 24 in third and 26 in fourth, which are very low levels. Then we have the number of sections. So 21, 22, that's what we have currently this year. And then 22, 23 is what we're expecting in the 22, 23 school year. These projections are based on our most recent demographic study, which was done in May of 2021. The demographic calculation looks at many factors, live births in Westchester County, housing turnover, proposed new developments, and migration patterns within the district. So these numbers, as Superintendent Walker indicated, have been very on target since I've come to the district, and they're a good guide for us. As you will see in kindergarten, we are expecting to go up over 20 students to 130 students. That's due primarily to the extreme amount of births in 2017, which will impact Croton students. So that is the most volatile figure. And as you will see, the first orange line for kindergarten, which is 21.7, and then the second for first grade, which is 21.6. Those are both at the cusp of the guidelines that we like to adhere to within the district. So to account for that, we have a contingency for one teacher. If you said, and I apologize, I'm going to go backwards for a second. So if you see the 226, that means that we are gaining a teacher in kindergarten and we are losing a section in second grade. So net, we are even. However, we have one contingency in the budget because we are expecting that one of those grades could potentially go over. And then we also have a kindergarten aide, which we will surely need since this kindergarten class is going up one section.
So if the kindergarten turns out to be larger, then we'd have to go to 7th section.
Correct. Which will be a
And that's
first.
fine. Yeah,
Yeah.
which
we've
will
never
be-
had that.
Do
No,
we have
Not
a
since
class
I've been on the board.
we're looking into that, yes. And that is a possibility.
Just to make sure I understand this. Sorry, go ahead.
You might ask the same question.
Okay, so just to make sure I'm understanding the number of sections. So we're saying if we were to end up with 4 sections, we'd have 32, and in kindergarten, we'd have 32.5, students.
Correct.
If we go with 6, it's 21.7. Okay.
Correct.
Right.
So my question was, Denise, you said it's a contingency in the budget or is it an actual hire?
It's a contingency.
So right now, we're expecting that it would be neutral. It would be, there would be no change in the total number of sections.
Correct.
We
But
could,
that could change if
That
those, if
can
the,
change in August or September.
right.
And though our enrollment projections are very close, there's a lot at play here. Private and parochial placements have changed, homeschool, the number of homeschool students has changed. There's a lot at play that we can only project at this point.
we could end up adding 2 sections
We could,
very easily
we could.
because of the situation in 1st grade as well.
So we want to be prepared and we will be watching those numbers very
Mhm.
closely.
And I do understand that these numbers all get increasingly accurate as we get closer to the end of the year.
So I have to say, with kindergarten enrollment, it seems like every September we're on the edge, which, are we going to get 2 more students that move in that are going to really move the figures? So,
Well- Let me just make one thing very clear.
yes, thank you, Neil. Guidelines.
These are guidelines. They are not limits. We have no obligation if we have, let us say, 5 sections in kindergarten, in 1st grade, and we have 111 students. We are not opening a 6th section in that situation. We have had situations in the past, mainly in 3rd and 4th grade. But we've had situations where we have operated above the guidelines. And in other districts where they're not guidelines, but they're absolute limits, either established by policy or established by collective bargaining agreements, you exceed the guideline, you exceed that limit, somebody snaps a finger and you have to hire another teacher. And when we put those guidelines in many years ago, we said very clearly, and everybody understands that, including our teaching staff, that they are guidelines.
Next, we will talk about revenues because they set the parameters for our operating budget and expenditures. Now we're going to go to the revenue slide. I'm going to begin with county sales tax. So this number remained strong throughout COVID, which was very surprising. We cut that projection for county sales tax last year when COVID hit, and surprisingly, we retained the full amount of our Westchester County sales tax contribution. So we are increasing that amount by $200,000 next year, and we are fairly certain that we meet that. Interest earnings, I don't expect that interest rates will rebound that quickly. So we've stabilized that figure at 12,000. You'll see an increase in building use fees as we hopefully open up the buildings to more outside entities to rent. That will increase. We also have our after-school program back in the building, which is providing an additional revenue stream. And then we have other revenue, which comes from some BOCES refunds, workers' comp reimbursements, insurance recoveries, et cetera. And we have that at 69,500, giving us a total of non-state aid revenue of 706,500. Next, we have state aid. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into that in the next slide. I will point out that on this slide, this is the 21-22 column is what was projected last year. So you'll see a slight deviation in that in the subsequent slide, because the subsequent slide shows our actual state aid revenue from this year. Then we have fund balance. So last year we contributed 2.3 million in our fund balance to offset the difference, the gap in between our revenues and our expenditures. And in 22-23, thanks to some increased state aid and federal funding, we are looking to decrease that to $1.9 million, and then a reserve offset of 400,000. The allowable tax levy is projected at 1 point. I'll get to that in the
Probably
allowable levy
1.2.
slide. 1 point.
An increase of 1.2.
No.
Oh, you're talking about
The allowable
The
tax
allowable
levy, I
tax levy.
apologize, I will get to that in the next slide. But the allowable levy is projected at 42,221,343, giving us a total revenue budget of 52,896,502, which represents a 4.1% increase budget to budget.
So to make clear, because one of the slides that I saw said 1.92% would be.
That's
That's
correct.
the
That's
tax
the
levy.
tax levy,
Right.
1.92.
So the point is that because of other revenue sources, like state aid and county sales tax, the budget you are going to be proposing will go up more than taxes. So
Correct.
people should understand that when they hear that the budget is a 4.18% increase, it doesn't mean that the tax levy is going up 4.18%.
The tax levy is a 1.92% increase.
And I know one of the questions that, maybe I'll be taking this from Iris, is we don't necessarily have to go to the maximum tax levy, 1.92%. We've discussed that in previous years. What would happen if we didn't? Because, there are countervailing issues regarding what you do in subsequent years, as well as, the effect on our taxpayers. So I'm sure that's something that Iris will be discussing.
Maybe.
I'm just saying, because history has been for the last
Yes,
9
yes,
years,
yes.
that's what we did.
Yeah,
Discuss with you.
that one doesn't concern me as much as the increase,
Okay.
but it might. I gotta see the numbers. Anna, did you have a question?
No.
No, okay. Okay, so this is about.
A question, sorry, Denise, sorry to interrupt. So in terms of the 20, sorry, on the previous slide, I think it was the 2021, so it's 21-22 number. You said that was projected from last year. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, so the state aid line, the 6098292, that's what we projected in last year's budget for state aid, but it was actually, as you'll see in the next slide, it was slightly higher.
the actual was slightly
There you
higher.
go. Yeah.
6.192 as opposed to 6098.
Got it.
And does the actuals here, do they tie to the adjusted budget that was in the part of what was presented at the last budget meeting? Well, it wasn't presented, it was in the consent agenda.
Right. I'm sorry, say that again?
So what I'm trying to gauge is the actual 21-22 column, right? Does that tie back to the adjusted budget that was in the documents from last board meeting? Or has it been updated since then?
Off the top of my head, I don't know if it was our projection. Usually we do budget to budget. So when you're doing budget to budget, it was what was projected the year prior as opposed to the actual. So I'm not quite sure. I would assume that it would be the budget to budget, the projection as opposed to the actual, because we didn't have some of these figures in at that.
Yeah, this is the more up-to-date figure.
Correct. So as you can see from the top line, foundation aid is a considerable increase. We're looking to receive an additional 773,000 in foundation aid this year. And this is bringing us to full restoration. Transportation aid, we've had some increased expenses and some efficiencies in transportation. So we're looking for an additional 82,000. The next large area is building aid. So we went out to bond for the 2018 capital project. All of those projects, actually, the projects are not fully complete at this time, but we expect that the final piece of that will be completed probably by the end of this month, at which time we will complete all of our final cost reports. No aid can be generated until the project is closed, certificates of substantial completion are issued, and then the final cost reports completed. So we are going to be very busy. We have about 11 projects that need to have final cost reports submitted, and that will occur between now and December 31st of this year. And that will generate an additional 571,000 in building aid for us. And then the other amounts are small. And again, these are preliminary based on the executive budget right now. Thank you. So now we get to
Denise, but before we move on, Denise, can you, I just noticed the decrease in BOCES aid,
yes.
and what is the source of that? Is that?
That is generated through BOCES projections as far as our estimated expenses. So that number generally is undervalued, and we usually get like a small refund prior year from BOCES based on an under projection, but these are numbers that are calculated from BOCES based on our actual usage.
Okay,
Again,
so this tracks with our actual BOCES expense.
yes,
Okay,
yes.
so with it's projected that our BOCES expenses are going to go down, therefore our BOCES aid goes down.
Not necessarily our expenses are going to go down. So certain salaries and benefits within BOCES are capped. When those are capped, we cannot receive aid on the amounts above that cap. So for example, this year, we're seeing an 8% increase in our health insurance benefits through the consortium that Putnam Northern Westchester BOCES is also a part of. Between their salaries and benefit increases, we are going to hit caps, which are going to take away from our expenditure, which will take away from our aidable expenditures.
Okay.
So I expect that this is an area that there's deviation. Again, these are projections based on a point in time, and that changes. Next we have our tax cap. Just to go back a little, just to to talk about our revenues in general. The allowable tax levy represents about 80% of our revenue, and then 14% in state aid. Our state aid percentage in the past was around 12%, but with the restoration of foundation aid and also with the building aid, it's up to about 14%.
Denise, is the expectation with the restoration of foundation aid, it's going to continue at
Yes.
that level?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. This is very
What about giving
promising.
us back the money that they
That they've been
that they
squandered.
never gave us, that they still owe us from the past 15 years?
I thought that was going to be something that was never going to happen. So the
Yeah.
fact that, we've been talking about this for
Right.
8 years,
Yeah,
right? And the fact
absolutely.
that it's been restored is just remarkable.
Yes.
Yeah, this is money
It's
that's
a
owed
big-
to us. It's not that it's, you're right, Josh, not money that they're allocating, additional money that they're allocating. It's past owed.
That said, there also seems to be appetite to look at that formula as well and to
Yes.
update that formula.
And then
So,
that's where the
which is
equity-
also a huge thing. And, we've all been talking about it for ages and has never really been a consideration.
Yeah.
So,
And that's where the equity comes in. It's an archaic formula. So that is also in advocacy and the budget as well.
Mhm.
So our preliminary tax cap. So the first line is our prior year tax levy. That's always where we begin. The prior year tax levy, and then we multiply that by the tax base growth factor. Tax base growth factor is basically brick and mortar growth and development within the community. It is a year or so behind. So if you recall, last year, our tax base growth factor went from, I believe it was 0.56 to 0.22. And I think we lost approximately $250,000 in revenue due to that reduction in our growth factor. So this year it's up 0.003%, affording us an approximate $104,000 or $5,000. At that point, we take the prior year's capital exclusion. That's that first line in blue. I will point out the two light blue lines, the capital exclusion for this year, the 365, and the lower number, the 26,400, the 22,641,271. That's our capital exclusion for this year. The goal is to keep those as balanced as possible, because any deviation in that, a shortfall one year or excess the following year, will cause a ripple effect to the tax cap for a number of years. So you're always trying to stabilize that capital exclusion. The capital exclusion is a complex formula that includes our building aid, our transportation aid with some factors associated with it, any debt service, BOCES capital aid, and some other factors. So there are a lot of moving parts. So to keep those balanced from year to year takes some long-term planning. Oh, I'm sorry. Could you just go back? Thank you, Steve. So that is giving us a proposed preliminary tax levy of 1.92% year to year.
Before
That's
you
the
do, just
change in the tax level.
Right, change
Change in the tax.
I just want to note that there is a line, this is, that we've talked about in past years called prior year pilots.
Correct.
Okay, there is a proposal, still hasn't gotten to the point of getting completely financed to build affordable housing units in the village. Pursuant to a pilot, we have, the board in past years has advocated with respect to that amount, which would be, once it's done, $70,000 increased by 3% each year for the life of, I think it's 20 years or 25 years, and then that will be a fully tax-paying piece of property. So that will take effect after occupancy of the buildings, if the buildings are ever built, and then that will go into that line the same way as we've collected taxes.
Correct.
And then, so that changes the calculus, but if people see that and they think about what has been discussed regarding the Katz property in the past, that's where it's gonna come in the future, because it's not taxes, but it's payment in lieu of taxes.
Right, and that will be an offset to the capital exclusion as well. So that will impact the formula from year to year. Okay, fund balance. So the controller, though he'll never admit to anything, generally based on the last 5 or 10 years of school district audits, recommends between a 2 to 5% fund balance year to year. So fund balance is essentially our revenues for 1 year compared to our expenditures for that year. Any additional becomes fund balance. State limits the fund balance to 4% that can be retained by districts.
The
Just-
the
The
unrestricted fund balance.
Unrestricted fund balance. So that is a fund balance that can be used for a number of reasons, to carry you until your taxes are received, to offset unanticipated expenditures, et cetera. 4%, just to put it in perspective, is equivalent to about 2 weeks of expenditures for the district. So it's not a lot of money. It's about 2 weeks worth of our expenditures. It's used to cover unbudgeted emergency necessities, relied on for cash flow between July and October before we receive our full tax revenue. Eliminates the need to borrow. A lot of, not so much recently, but certainly a lot of special act districts issued TANs, which are tax anticipation notes, RANs, and TANs for school districts. RANs are revenue anticipation notes. Because there is that gap between when you're receiving the bulk of your revenue and when you have to actually start paying your salaries and expenses. So the fund balance allows us to utilize those funds when revenues are low. Of course, reliance on fund balance to fund the gap between state aid and the tax cap has been essential to all districts, especially in Westchester County, due to the fact that we have less state aid, but we need to guard against over-reliance on it, of course. Okay, so reserves. This is a snapshot of our reserves. I'll just go through them briefly. If you have any questions, we have our workers' comp reserve that allows us to utilize those funds to pay for workers' comp benefits. If we have an individual who's out and receiving full pay, we utilize those funds for that. Our unemployment reserve for ERS and TRS, that's the employee retirement system and the teacher's retirement system. As an employer, we are required to contribute to their a percentage of their salaries to the retirement system. Then we have a reserve for accrued liability, tax certiorari reserve, an employee benefit accrued liability reserve. That is for retirees who are receiving sick day compensation and other benefits. And then we have our capital reserve of $7,077,011. 2013, we had a capital reserve in 2013 and 2016. We have approximately 2.4 million in the 2013 reserve and 4.7 million in the 2016 reserve.
I'm sorry, I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
Could you just explain the movement in the numbers on the reserve for the TRS contribution and the reserve for accrued liability? Like everything across the line kind of goes stable, but those numbers are.
So TRS is actually a new reserve. I
Okay.
believe it was implemented 2 years ago.
2019 was.
2019, the 250 was the
Right,
first.
right. And so you were limited as to what you can contribute, and then now it's a percentage of your salaries for the subsequent year.
Okay.
So that's why that increased. It was a brand new reserve that was a hard fought effort on behalf of local superintendents and school boards, because our pension costs are so excessive. We had TRS has spiked between upwards of 14% down as low as 6%. So
And
it's,
even before that, there were times when things were so flush that there was no increase.
no increase,
Because
right?
they just, because the investments had worked so well that they said actuarially, we don't need any contribution. I'm talking a while ago. But that's basically what it is. It's very complex to understand how they come up with their actuarial assumptions, but we don't have any choice. If they say you are gonna pay
18%.
18% of your salaries for this retirement, that's what you do.
And the accrued liability, Denise?
The employee accrued liability reserve, that is for example, in our collective bargaining agreements, individuals get paid a certain daily rate for sick time that's in excess of, let's say, 100 days. So we would pay those sick days through that fund.
Did you mean the benefit one, or did you mean the accrued liability reserve?
Accrued liability is the one that's grown over.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is a legal liability reserve.
Okay,
That's also relatively new, if I
It
recall.
is, it is.
okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Denise, on the capital reserve, in 2013, 2016, those were the years where they were established?
Correct.
And were they established for specific projects in mind?
So the capital reserve, to establish them, you need voter approval, and then to designate them, you also need
Right.
voter
So
approval.
I think,
project was.
yeah, it was not for a project. It was basically for setting aside money, knowing that we were going to use it for projects that were not necessarily determined at the time the reserve was established.
Mhm.
And monies that were, if you want to call it, left over at the end of the year would be placed there as, in essence, a reserve, a savings account for doing the work that needs to be done. And some of the work that we've done, even where we've had a bond, we have allocated some of the capital reserve funds
Mhm.
to that work in addition to money that we borrowed through bond anticipation notes and then later on through perhaps full bonds. Question that I have on that, and Omar, I didn't mean to cut you off if you need more info, but as of,
The expiration.
no, as the expiration is 10 years. Know that. My question is that the balance as of June 30th, 2021. So it does not include at this point any expenditures out of either of those reserves for the work done, paid for subsequent to June of 2021. Any of the work we've done last summer, any of the work we've done during the year. Do you have a sense at this point?
We're very close to that figure. Most of the work, so what was paid out of our capital reserve were our kitchens at PVC and CET. And we did a district-wide phone installation. That was already paid, and then we have a balance due for a district-wide drainage.
So we have, in essence, almost all of that $7 million still in reserves for any of the work that
For future
you've
capital
been
work.
talking about, the project work in, that are being considered in this budget for any work that may be done next year at the beginning of our building condition survey and 5-year
Yeah.
plan we'll be talking about.
Correct.
Yep. And that's going to be expensive, right? We all know that that's going to be really expensive. And in looking at this line, it's trending in the wrong direction for me. You know, as a person that manages financial institutions, educational institutions, and looking at their finances, I would like to see this number grow. So to do that, though, it's
Which number?
You're saying the capital reserve number grow?
we'd have to put it up to vote for the. You said we have to designate a specific project in mind and put
I'm
it
sorry.
as part of the budget vote.
I don't understand which number you're talking about.
Well, I'm talking about the last one, the capital reserve. It was 8 million
Okay.
in 2019, went down 7.1, down to 7. is going to, I think, continue to dwindle. And that is a really good use of earmarked funds because you never know what happens, right? One rainstorm, one flood, one lightning bolt, whatever it is, right? You're going to need to tap into this reserve at some point. Nobody knows what it is, but it's good to have it in your back pocket. And again, a school district of the size, this is a number that I would like to see grow somehow.
Oh,
I'm
by
not
the
sure
way,
the right
that
mechanism.
is, and this is a question, the next question I was going to ask is, at some point, what you need to do is go to the voters and say, voters, we authorize us to, in essence, or do you authorize us in essence to set up another bank account, call it the 2022 capital reserve. And that resolution will state you can save up to X dollars. These are each total of 5 million, which then can be spent within 10 years, right? And that is funded by, if you will, money that has not been expended from our operating budget during the year when, in June of each year, we make allocations to the various reserves. And so if we have money left over, right, somewhere between 2 and 5%, as the commission, as the controller would like, we say, all right, we're going to replenish all of the reserves that need replenishing, and we're going to take a bunch of money and we're going to put that into the capital reserve. Once you've hit that 5 million to put into that bank account, call it for 2013, 2016, we can't put anything more in. That's frozen. So would have to go to the voters and say, voters, will you give us the authorization to set up the next bank account? And my question, Denise, is given what we've talked about and what we're anticipating, is it the recommendation of administration that we consider establishing the next capital reserve fund, 2022 capital reserve fund? That's something that you desire to request this year, looking at what's going to be coming up in the future and looking about what expenditures we're going to have out of what we've already saved. What are you thinking?
I think it gets complicated, so we are just retaining an architect and engineer to look at some capital improvements or building condition survey, et cetera. With the potential, we have some debt dropping off, so the potential is to possibly institute a new bond referendum. I think if you combine all of that and try to communicate that effectively to the taxpayer, it's a challenge. It's a lot of different components. So I would imagine that if we were to proceed with a capital project, that it would be a combination possibly of financing through a bond, maybe some capital reserve funds. So I think that to then add a new referendum to the voters for a capital reserve fund, I think it could be complicated. I think it could be confusing to articulate all of that information to the voters in 1 year.
Well, one question on that is how much space do we have, room do we have in the 2016 reserve?
Very little. I don't have the exact figure, but I think it's between 200,000 and 300,000.
Okay, which means basically when we
We're
get to the
almost
point of
capped. Yep.
allocating reserves, wherever that money is going to go, with not a whole lot can go into savings for capital needs.
Right. And we are close to maxed out on that reserve.
Okay. And I guess this
Which is
goes into school financing and reserves. If we do have a lot of money left over on June 30th, and we can't put it in the capital reserve, and the other reserves are limited by how much you can put in. You can't put $10 million in the tax reserve just because you have it. If you can't prove
No.
that, you're now, we have to do something with that money because we can't go over the unfunded balance. And what happens is you're lowering taxes and using more, lowering the tax levy, which has its own issues and complications because of the future year tax levy. So all I'm saying is, I don't want to dismiss that out of hand at this point
No,
until we have a better sense of where we may be, at June of 2022. And it may be that worth it at this point, if if it makes sense, to ask the voter approval and then fill that in anticipation of what the work we're going to be doing.
So I have to, you know what I'm gonna say, right?
Mhm.
Okay, so the 2013 hasn't been spent yet. There's still, you said approximately 2 million in that. And there's no outstanding projects that it would most likely currently
Yes.
in work.
the drainage.
The
Yes.
800,000 for the
Yeah.
drainage. So that would leave about.
Good.
That'll leave about 1.2 million. Neil, to your point, we have one reserve that will be fully funded that we haven't used. We have another reserve, but that one is expiring in 2023.
Yes.
So we gotta figure out to use it, otherwise we gotta return that. But now you want to set up a third one. It's just like, no, I'm not saying you want to, but now the discussion that's going on is setting up a third one. It just seems like we're gonna keep setting up so that we can keep having a place to put money that's left over in the budget. And what I want to always impress is the budget shouldn't be drawn with an intent to create excess so that we can put it away into an account. We should try to always keep the taxpayers, but because that money comes from, that excess comes from the taxpayer and it's used to build as a basis for next year, increasing it even more.
And
So I would prefer the philosophy be to stay, we conservatively budget. We don't budget with the intent to try to have funds left over. You don't want to be so close that
right.
you're irresponsible, but 2% is, and I'm not suggesting that that's what you're saying,
No,
but that,
I'm in agreement with
that's
you.
what the.
I'm just saying that
concern
if you
I
don't
have.
know until May
Right,
how much you've got at the end of the year, it's too late to establish a capital reserve if you have more money left over than you anticipated.
doesn't the statute say it goes back to the taxpayer? at that
But
point?
then it goes back to the taxpayer in terms of a lower tax levy, which we established in August. And then, of course, the issue going forward is, since you can only increase,
Right.
maximum, let's say 2% above your previous tax levy, if, our tax levy is 0, well, we can increase, we don't get to manage. So all I'm saying is,
And that has like a ripple effect for
it has a
years.
ripple effect, as we've discussed in years past. So all I'm saying is, I'm not saying do it. I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying, I think
Think about
we should think about it and know before the deadline, which is going to be late March, I guess it is if we feel that we, should establish it or not. And I'm not saying, I'm not taking a position. I'm just saying, keep it on the radar.
So just a couple more thoughts on this. It may be beneficial to wait for the building condition survey to come out so we do identify specific projects to earmark. My sense is that in the private independent school space, we have seen an influx of one-time sources of revenue, right? Specifically because of COVID. And that if the public school system is receiving similar funding, that is one time, right? A good use of a one-time resource, right, is to establish some kind of reserve for it to again, earmark it for something that you're going to be spending in the future. And I agree with what you're saying, Neil, that we shouldn't say we're going to do it and we shouldn't say we're not going to do it. I think it's really worthwhile exploring because this is essentially an insurance policy for the future and protects the school district from spikes in the event that something happens.
And I think, the flip side of that, and I know this, as Iris has said, is if we can provide some relief to the taxpayers this year by not going to the max and, establishing a reserve, that's a decision we as a board make, to which we may feel is beneficial because we really don't know what those expenditures are going to be. That may come out of the building condition survey. And so we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. And that's a discussion for us to have. I just wanted to put it on the table for the future. And Omar, I think I appreciate your point, and I know we all do, and I appreciate Iris's point, and I always have.
And then the last thing on this for me is, if we think, and I guess a question for you, Denise, do you think we're going to hit the 4%? Sorry, what's the term you used? Fund balance. Yeah, we call something different. But do you think we're going to hit that 4% cap this year?
Can I hold my answer and?
Oh,
say-
absolutely. No, that's part of the thinking, right? That if we think we're going to be close to that level.
Yes, yeah, I will say that there are districts who have exceeded that consistently. We have never.
Well, those didn't happen. No,
Did we?
15,
Not for quite
17
some
years ago,
time.
we did it. And then finally, we kind of said, well, you know what, who cares up in Albany? And then they came and they went like that to us. And so we said, okay. Now, there are other districts who still, flout the rule.
Consistently, yeah.
And we, after having had our wrist slapped by the controller, probably to Napoli, or before to Napoli, I don't remember who. We decided, we're gonna.
You're gonna play by the rules,
Right.
yes.
And that was also back in a situation, a time frame when there was no tax cap, and we were doing 5, 6, 7, 8% tax increases because inflation was higher, and that's what we needed to do. But that's not where we are now.
Thanks. First time through the budget here, so forgive me if this was just talked about, but in terms of the building condition survey and the projects that we've talked about there, particularly the athletics complex as part of that, where does that fit in with the budget cycle? So we're talking about the reserves. Does that go back to the taxpayers at some point through this cycle? Oh, how does that fit in?
So are you talking about the services that we just requested proposals for?
Well, like the output from that, so the estimation and the determination that we're gonna do, that this project, let's say for the athletic complex, is gonna cost this much money.
Okay.
If that was something that was put forward, is that something that is
That was
is the output
not-
of that condition survey going into this budget cycle this year? At all?
No, it's separate. So the cost for the services that we've requested from the RFP for the architectural engineering services,
Mhm.
I believe that those funds can be expended from this current budget. So again, the RFP that was issued late 2021, and I'll just, if you don't mind, I'll just go and just give a brief update on that. Would that be okay? Okay.
That'd be great.
Because I know that there's been some inquiry from the
Mhm.
public. So we issued a multi-tiered RFP for architectural engineering services that included building condition survey, 5-year plan, turf field feasibility study, district-wide drainage, and kindergarten AC. So air conditioning in kindergarten, and then general architectural and engineering services. We received 5 proposals, and we assembled a selection committee with representation from the Board of Education, staff, and our administrators. From those 5, 2 firms were selected to return for an in-person interview with the entire committee. And we had that interview on Friday, I believe, Friday of last week. Based on the feedback from the committee, The administration plans to recommend to the Board of Education for our next meeting, the firm that we feel is best positioned to accommodate that RFP request moving forward. Upon selecting the firm, we will then certainly engage with the community, possibly develop a facilities planning team and so forth, to look at the various projects that we've submitted. And then we'll of course inform the community on a regular basis. But right now, the turf field that we RFP'd was just a feasibility study. We didn't request a turf field. So once the feasibility study is done, then we can convene as a board, as a community, to determine how we would like to proceed with that. And that is the same for the 5-year plan. And
So-
that is outside of budget. It
And that
will
timing is,
most likely be through, if we decide to proceed, it will be through a bond referendum and maybe a combination of capital reserves.
and is that bond referendum something that's done at the same time as this budget? I'm not familiar. with when
I
that-
know.
Or it can be
It's-
done anytime during the year?
Yes,
Is
it
that-
can be done anytime during the year. And it is a long process. It's not a quick turnaround.
Just two things. First, when you say the costs for the services, the feasibility study, et cetera, will come out of this budget, you're talking about the
21,
22,
21, 22.
20. In other words, we'll be able to pay for the services prior to June 30th.
That is
Or
our
encumber
goal
that
to-
money at least prior to June
Yeah.
30th. So the other thing to answer, or to kind of give some explanation to Mary, is that once we have a project, you go to the voters and you say, we have a project, let's say, to put in air conditioning. It's gonna cost $622,000 based on what the architects have developed, and we're gonna do this at the athletic field, and we're gonna do this here, this year. Voters, give us the approval to borrow, bond, $7 million, just picking a number out of the air, for these projects. So you don't do that until you know exactly what that money is for, because there is a rule called arbitrage,
Mhm.
which means you are not allowed to get the money ahead of time until you really need it. You're not allowed to get approval from the voters, and you're not allowed to actually, sell the bonds and then, try to invest it and make more money. That's not. Public
So not
school
allowed to
district.
indulge in
We
arbitrage.
can't engage in arbitrage. I did also want to point out that the air conditioning, the kindergarten, though ARP funds have been allocated for that. So those funds, those one-time funds, Omar, will be used to support the air conditioning at the kindergarten level. Then the district-wide drainage is a component of the capital reserve.
And
So
can we
really-
use the district-wide drainage? So, sorry, you said the 2013 was the reserve for the drainage?
Yes,
And so can that be
And the
used to
approval from the
pay?
voters on it.
I'm sorry?
We've already gotten approval from the voters on that drainage project.
Yeah. And is the field study part of that drainage scope of work?
no, it's a separate component. Of course, it'll have an impact
Mhm.
because field is all about drainage, right?
Yeah.
It'll have an impact, but no, but we could not utilize those funds for the purchase of these services or for the turf field.
And so you said the turf field may, just let's say it was some combination of a bond and a capital reserves. Just so I understand, the capital reserves does need to get voter approval to use what's already in there. Is that right?
It has to be redesignated
And is that at any time in the year, or does that have to be at the same time? as
any
the
time of the
budget?
year.
I see. Okay.
So as you can see,
Mhm.
articulating that to the community can be a challenge
Mhm.
with capital reserves, designations, bond referendums, et cetera. So the timing and the planning for that needs to be thought out.
And I'll just, Mary, let you know, we try to tie it to the budget because there's an expense to running the election for the counts, but you gotta figure out when to actually, do you want to do it with your budget? Do you want to take the extra expense and do it, outside of the budget cycle? I think the last one we did it like in November. Because it's like this really, you beat yourself up on it because the history here is that there was a bond that failed. And so that's why the whole capital projects using that to fund repairs occurred, because there was a bond and the community said no. And so the work needed to be done. Neil can tell you one day the fun of trying to find out how to get the money to do it.
And the other thing that's also part of that for timing is after you've got approval, then you have to get plans completed and you have to give them to Albany. And you want Albany, and they have a long, or not so long, but right now it's getting longer lag time to approve your plans. And it's like getting a building permit. And then you want to do that, so you've got the plans and the money borrowed and the contractors lined up so that you can start doing your work the day of middle school graduation, right? Because if you don't, then you can't get the work done until a year from now. And then, so it's the whole jigsaw puzzle that we work through in looking at everything relating to capital improvements.
Yeah, and sorry, I know I said it was going to be the last comment, but this is the last comment on the capital reserve. As you're talking about this, I think the narrative that I would venture to communicate with the public is, with the expectation of interest rates rising, and if we're being cognizant about not increasing costs or passing on the cost to taxpayers, that we have to come up with some kind of strategy that uses the combination of not just funding it fully by debt and not paying for it fully by the reserve, but that there's some kind of some form of combination of the two that somehow optimizes the cost to the taxpayer. That's my last comment on capital reserves.
We'll put you on the communications committee. Thank you, Omar. So now we'll go to expenses. Next slide. Oh, apologize. This is a difficult slide to read. So this is our general support budget. So speaking of voting, this year you'll see there's a slight increase because we are participating in a service. It's a software called Bold, which is an enhanced electronic voting software that Tracy pursued, and we will be implementing that very shortly. So that is the dollar change in the Board of Education. Then central administration, that's a reduction due to some retirement breakage. Financial auditing, fiscal agents, this is due to increased auditing costs related to the single audit, also anticipated fiscal advisor fees and some salary adjustments for staff. Legal personnel information, public information. This is just a moderate increase to legal. Facilities, operations, and maintenance. So our utility increases that I'm sure everyone is experiencing personally already are expected to potentially exceed 25 to 30%, which is enormous. Fortunately, we are in the midst of our energy performance contract, so the rewards and benefits of that project will be realized next year. So the 25 to 30% that we're anticipating, we're actually, Paul and I were working with Honeywell to calculate actually the savings that will be generated through those upgrades, but it still is a considerable increase to our utilities. Also, this department is heavily weighted in supplies and materials, which with supply chain issues, delivery increases, and certainly CPI, it's going to be hit harder than most departments because it's generally supplies and materials. Then we have property assessments and BOCES administration. That is directly related to increased BOCES capital and administrative costs. Again, that goes back to salary caps. Next
Denise,
slide. Yeah.
could you just clarify that we are not salaried, that Board of Education budget looks really hefty there.
No.
Explain what's in that, so folks don't think it's a,
Yeah.
we don't spend 131 to
No.
7.
Correct. So, so there is, the district clerk is in that position, in that budget code. Then we have additional memberships to associations, national school boards, et cetera. The cost of voting, the cost of our public notices. So we have extensive requirements with regard to legal notice postings. Our advertising costs have just gone through the roof because the mandates are getting more stringent. The advertising costs are becoming, more and more expensive. So we've seen that's all Board of Ed, not stipends for you guys. Okay. go
But
next
before,
one.
I'm sorry, before we move on, could we just go back to that? The legal, as you recall, we extended our contract with our district council.
Mhm.
And presumably that, we extended it, I believe, for a year, is that correct?
Well,
It wasn't necessarily an extension. It was I believe it was
we
as a
basically did
board, you
not,
decided not to.
We
change
decided not to
council.
change at this time,
right,
but we presumably we are going to have to go back and do that RFP.
I would presume at this
Yes.
point, we can't say, well, you gave us a proposal a year and a half ago, so, okay, now we'll look at it because they won't walk at the.
No, we'll be doing a
We'll do a
new,
new RFP.
and at the time, if I recall, we got, well, we for reasons of what we saw and the timing and the fact of everything else that was going on, we decided to push it off. But presuming that's coming back and that could potentially change. I don't think it's not going to change 22, 23 probably. Is it?
It's too late to start.
Yeah.
It's too late
It's a little late to start.
It's too late
our-
to start to have new council if we're gonna change our council for 22, 23.
Or put out a new RFP.
Or put out a new RFP to do it. So it doesn't affect 22, 23, but it could be a change. We could see some changes in that for 23, 24.
Right, and obviously that legal number includes both anticipated costs for non-retainer matters,
That-
which
yes.
you don't even
Right.
know what that's gonna cost
Right.
them. So it's a guesstimate.
Right, it's always.
Thank you. So next we get to instruction, administration, and improvement. So you'll see an increased cost here. Remember that these costs include both salaries, BOCES services, et cetera. So this year we have in there, we have Thought Exchange, Panorama, which is a new implement beginning next year. Actually, we added it this year, but it wasn't included in the original budget. So that's an additional cost, plus additional professional development, learning opportunities and training has been built in there. Then we have regular school teaching. This is predominantly related to the settlement of the collective bargaining agreement with the CTA, and also some supply restoration. So if you recall, last year, we made significant cuts to all of our supplies and materials budgets due to COVID. So there's some restoration there. The largest increase that you will see is pupil personnel. A big chunk of that is career and tech. So we have career and tech services through BOCES. And it's on a 3-year average with, I believe it's 6 data points that they calculate how many individuals are taking credits through the CTA program. So that has increased significantly. Also, there are salaries in there. Again, remember when our budget was prepared last year, we had 5 bargaining agreements open, 2 of which had expired the year before. So you're going to see extreme deviations here, especially when it comes to salaries. Instructional media, and technology. Then guidance and psychological services. This is predominantly staffing increases, co-curricular. This is salary increases and also additional programs that have the principals have requested for next year's budget, which we'll talk more about on Budget Saturday. And then another big increase is the athletics. So again, we implemented the 3 coordinator stipends for athletics. And then also we have some very exciting things going on in athletics. We have an allocation to restore the baseball field. We have the hockey merger. Also DJ, our athletic director, has built in funds for another fantastic homecoming and another spring event. And those are costly events. It involves a lot of heavy lift from our buildings and grounds, and also the rental of the spotlights, etc. So the Education Foundation assisted us, Booster Club last year. So we have incorporated those funds. Also some gym chairs. We're short on gym chairs, and soccer goals and other equipment are incorporated into that.
So I had a question about programs for students with disabilities versus on line 3 versus special schools on line 4.
The special schools is our summer program, and it's a very small piece of
Okay,
that.
so
number.
special schools is not outplacement
No,
to out of district special schools for special needs students.
No.
It's something different. It's the over the summer. Okay. So that's my only question.
So, yeah, question on that, just in terms of the increase in programs for students with disabilities and career and tech. Will we be able to have enough today on Budget Saturday, a description of our usage of career and tech, how many students are there, what
Yes,
programs are in,
absolutely.
et cetera? And also, just so we all understand, that line is also for all of our residential and non-residential private school placements and BOCES placements.
Yep, and yes, and our in-house related services and BOCES related services,
So the OT and PT and speech, that's all in that line.
etc.
Mhm. Okay.
I'm sorry, I do have another question. Am I correct to understand that our ELL expenditure, any additional expenditure specifically needed for ELL, for English language learners, is rolled into teaching regular school? Is that correct? Or is it on some
I
other
think it's
line here?
actually split between PPS and regular school.
Okay.
We currently do not have direct designation of ELL services.
Okay.
So they are a component of both regular school and PPS.
So if it's a component of PPS, is that it because the particular student in question is
Maybe an IEP.
is an IEP student? Okay, so in other words, we're not, we haven't separated that out into a separate line. So for regular school students, it's built into teaching regular school. And for kids with IEPs, it's under the
Pupil personnel
the
services.
programs for students with disabilities.
And
Okay.
how does that work in terms of a staff member who is working with a student based on, with an IEP and student not with an IEP in terms of, we have, I guess, CT, we have Janet Cueto, right? And so she's working with some kids who are on one side of the line, regular ed, some kids on the other side of the line. Does that kind of just get administratively allocated by the school administrators and then by you to how much will be charged to each budget line?
Yes, so I think when there's an appointment, if someone has a partial FTE with, let's say, in a special education class for 2 periods a day, that person, their FTE will be allocated to either a pupil personnel services code for students with disabilities or a regular education code, but not an ELL code
Mhm.
at this point.
But all AIS support is going to be in the programs for students with disability, even if AIS services are being provided to a student who's not classified, but we think they need help, or did to go through the same process for
Different in different
Okay.
buildings? Do you have any insight on that, John?
My understanding is that ELL, ENL services are not considered special education services. That those are part of a general education program, as are our AIS services. So if there is expenditures that are pertaining to either the teaching of L students or the remediation of general education students, that is considered general education services. Only where there are students with IEPs would that be then allocated to our special ed lines.
The reason I'm asking this, and I don't want an answer today, but I think it might be good to have some understanding of this perhaps in Budget Saturday, is what is our expenditure on services for English learners, right? And because I want to kind of have an understanding of how that, ideally, I'd like to have an understanding of how that's changing over time as the number of students needing that kind of services are changing.
But it sounds like that as far as staffing, that would be a combination.
I understand it cuts across both the line 2 and line 3, but I think it's still it's a different dimension. I think it might be worth looking at to understand how the needs, how the budget as a percentage of teaching, as a percentage of the overall budget is tracking with the need as a percentage of student. Does that make sense? But let's table it until Budget Saturday. Or later, if it takes time to get, I understand that the data might not be broken out that way, and so.
And
I
I
would
think
understand it's
for my,
not a rush.
and I agree with Josh, but I think for both, that's not really so much in order to understand the budget itself,
Right.
because we're going to provide those services as we are told are needed, but to just understand the scope of the issue problem and, how we deal with it as a district going forward.
Noted. Next.
You have a question? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a couple of questions. So on Budget Saturday, is that when we see the line items under these different buckets?
There'll be definitely, yes, more detail, so you can see each of the appropriations for these codes.
And appropriation means the expense
Mhm.
line by line. Okay.
Well, it's not
Well,
line.
it's not
by
line by
It's not a line by
line
line.
What level is it at? It would explain what's under those increases? Yeah, okay, cool. And then I noticed from 2021 to 21-22, overall increase was around 200,000. And then going from 21-22 to 22-23, it's 1 million. Is that typical? What's typical in years past? Like what?
Nothing's typical because of
Yeah.
COVID. So we made some significant cuts in 2021 and also 2022, 21-22. Because remember, COVID hit in February of 20. So that affected the 2021 budget. Increase into 21-22. It's just very hard to tell. We had at least I think a $585,000 budget cut due to COVID. And that year we also reduced the tax levy to compensate.
Denise, would you really call it a budget cut or we just reallocated?
No, we cut the
'Cause we didn't-
departmental budgets. We asked
cut the-
everybody to go back.
So it wasn't a cut, it's just that we asked everyone to go back and re-examine their budgets and come in a little bit. Because cut implies that we dropped something or in my mind, that we dropped something or we lost something. And my recollection is we were more pushing very hard that we wanted almost zero increase. That's why you see it's almost mirrored. We wanted a zero increase from budget to budget because of COVID and the economy as it existed at that time. So we asked all the departments to go back, look at your budget. And if there are things you can pull out that you are going to be advancing or asking to go forward, present it that way.
So in a a more typical year, it will, the 21-22 budget would have been higher, perhaps, right? So that it's not such a huge jump up, is that right? Okay.
And again, Mary, it has a lot to do with the fact that we had all of those open contracts with staff. So there were no settled contracts at that time.
Okay. And then the ESSER funds, those are separate from this, right? Because a lot of what we earmarked or what I think was earmarked from those funds was some similar things that I heard being discussed right now. So is that money also being used for some of these kinds of programs as well, like AIS and after school
We have,
professional development?
we have some, yes, absolutely. There's some, not duplications, but additional funds.
So that's outside of these numbers, right? That funding is not in here. Okay. Thank you.
Are there, actually, that begs another small question. Going back to on the aid side, on the revenue side,
Yes.
I don't see a line for the ESSER funds in the revenue side.
Right,
Okay,
because
this
that's
year.
outside of our operating budget.
Because it was all for items that were purchased or,
It was all for items outside of our regular operating budget. For example, the kindergarten AC. For a transition coordinator at the high school.
okay,
Other services. And you also, I just did want to point out that on my aid projection, you would not see the kindergarten program, the funding source. for
The UPK.
kindergarten, the UPK, I'm sorry, not kindergarten, UPK, because that is not considered aid, it's considered a block grant. So it does not come in, it's a net zero grant to us. It does not come in.
so
as
it's
aid.
outside of our
Operating
budget,
budget.
but it's sort of part of a super budget.
Exactly.
if you
A
will.
super budget that's not going to last for long.
Yes, but I think it might be, I think it might be worthwhile to see that, to have that information called out. Another thing, perhaps, not for tonight, but obviously for Budget Saturday, to have a slide on that explains it, because I know that people, I was gonna ask that if I hadn't seen it by the end of the night, so definitely interested to see.
Yeah, if I may, I think it'll be helpful in this. You guys may already have thought about putting this together for Budget Saturday or a later presentation. If you take the budget priorities and the initiatives that you've outlined previously on pages 5, I think 5, 6, and 7, if I'm not mistaken, or 5 and 6, and you identify specifically which line items those fall under. Because if you look at them in aggregate, there aren't really a significant or a material increase to the budget in and of themselves. I mean, you think there are other drivers of the budget that are causing it to be at the level that it is. I think it'll just be helpful for people to understand where specifically those initiatives are, which line items they fall under.
Well, I'm guessing some of that may be in a variety of different buckets, so to speak, but, you know, and some of it won't, but it's something worth.
Yeah, but I mean, you know, most of it's going to fall under instruction or under programs or for students with disabilities and career in tech, right? And it's not going to be under maintenance, right? But when you look at maintenance as a percentage, that has a significant increase. So when people are saying, or the community is asking, what is the budget funding? And we're putting this for them as to vote on, that while we are saying that this budget really addresses some of the key pedagogical questions that we've wanted to address, the cost of those incremental programmatic increases aren't material as related to or in comparison to some other line items in the budget that are out of our control.
Yeah, that makes sense, Omar. We can certainly do that for Budget Saturday.
And remember, we are a service industry. 75 to 80% of our budget is salaries and benefits. So that is the bulk. Okay, next, pupil transportation. This full amount is due to the settlement of our ATU contract and our CSEA contract. Both of those contracts were expired for over a year, and we settled with them. We settled those contracts this year. So that will be the majority of that increase. Then we have employee benefits. That includes our health insurance plan, which as I've shared, has gone up 8%. We are still below the average of the other participating, the other plans within our region, like Empire, Blue Cross Blue Shield, Swiss Chip, et cetera. But it was a hard hit increase of 8%. In addition to that, the teachers' retirement system, the employer contribution went up to 10.29%. It was about 0.5%, which is equivalent to approximately $100,000 based on our salaries. Then we have debt service. This is related to the recent bonding for the last capital project. Remember, when we have a bond referendum, we usually issue a ban. We can issue a ban for up to 5 years. Ban is a bond anticipation note. It's short-term borrowing. Because at the beginning of the project now that project occurred, the voters voted on it over 5 years ago. We're still not fully complete with that project. So if you bond early on, you're borrowing and paying to borrow money for a very, very long period of time when you're not actually using it. So what we do is we do short-term bans every year so that we only borrow what we anticipate needing until the completion of the project, and at which time we bond. We bonded last year at a very opportune time. We got phenomenal rates. Save the district a lot of money, but still we have debt service that's incurred, and the increase to that is approximately $248,000. And then the other financing cost is Just those are interfund transfers for our school lunch program and our summer handicap program to cover those increased expenses.
Is there a reason why employee benefits is listed on a separate section rather than broken out by the employee benefits that are relative to each of the segments of the other segments of the budget?
So those are our 9,000 codes, debt service, and so.
No, I understand that
what-
the accounting codes say that it has to be this way, but I mean, ideally, you'd want to know what the cost of employee benefits are for teachers for teaching versus the employee benefits for transportation
Right.
versus.
And you will
and so
see
on.
that in one of our budget
Okay,
statements,
great.
which was capital, admin, and instructional salaries and benefits appropriated accordingly.
Okay, thanks.
So that, yeah, that's actually a state requirement.
Got it. Thank you.
It's called the administrative breakdown. Good question. Okay, next, so some of the challenges, certainly state and national political and economic landscapes. We don't know what's happening. Will they remove the funding for our school lunch program? We certainly know that the ARP and ESSER funds are going to be winding down, not this year, but next year. So we're not sure of that. COVID-19, how will that impact us? Another factor and unknown variable is kindergarten registration and enrollment. And again, this all relates to staffing. Our enrollment, our high school course registration, English as new language learners, and also special education placements and classification. Special education is the place where we are most vulnerable. Those costs for a residential placement can be upwards of $150,000, and that's for one student. So we do have some contingency in our budget for that, but that is again a very vulnerable spot that every district and the state has to deal with. The final allowable tax levy, we still are tweaking. A lot of the state numbers for aid and so forth are not final. So there might be some minor adjustments to that. And that is due on March 1st. Then we have the final state aid allocation, which will be in the governor's budget on April 1st. And then, of course, our year-end fund balance, which once we get through February, we'll have a clearer picture of that, and that will only become clearer as we go through the coming months. And then growing mandates without financial relief, which is a major issue that we faced for a long time. So next, we will talk about district and statewide advocacy initiatives. The revision to the foundation aid formula for equity purposes and just time. They are, this is from I think the Council of School Superintendents and also the School Boards Association to increase capital outlay limit from 100 to 250,000 and or 500,000. So right now, we can expend $100,000 under our general fund and receive aid. The proposal is to increase that to 250 or 500,000 and make that capital outlay aidable to school districts. Increase aidability on CAPS, career and tech, BOCES salaries. There's actually some movement in this area that seems promising. Of course, increase the limit of unrestricted fund balance. There are numbers coming out between 8 and 10% possibly. Tax cap elimination of negative tax caps. So a lot of districts, especially due to pilots, as you were speaking before, Neil. So pilot initiatives or capital outlay expenses can actually send a district into a negative tax cap. So this is a proposal to end negative tax caps and keep the floor zero. There's also school representation on IDA boards, Industrial Development Act, so they are responsible for pilots. There are no districts at the table negotiating with them, so there is a initiative out there to at least get us into the conversation. And then
I should point out that our district, we don't have any land that I know of in our district that would be eligible at this point for IDA
IDA.
funding. It's usually for industrial projects and warehouses and things like that that are happening elsewhere where the developer goes to get a development aid from this source, which is then financed through public
IDA.
bonding, and we don't have that, so that really doesn't affect us.
I can only imagine two possible properties that it could possibly apply to.
Yeah, but it's probably not a large,
Yeah.
it's not a
It's
large.
not significant.
And then lastly, repealing the financial transparency report. That is a report that is almost a duplication of another report that's required at the federal level. But it's done completely differently and they are not comparable. So it involves almost the same amount of work, but it is completely different with no utility whatsoever. And then,
Is that the one where, or is it a different one where you do have to do a report school by school? You know, to talk about, so that there can be a supposed determination whether or not resources are being allocated,
correct.
you know, to, you know, fairly among all of your elementary schools in our district. And we have to do it even though we only have one elementary school and one middle school and one high school. That's the one you're
Right.
talking about.
That's the transparency and the ESSA report is almost the same identical report. But the logic behind the calculations is completely different. So we are calling for repeal on that.
You know, it would be fine if New York State just required to submit the same federal report to
To the
them.
state, right?
Well, but I think the New York State came first and then ESSA came.
No, I think so too.
So,
When it's transparency reporting, there is a lot of moaning going on.
The problem is,
Transparency.
the problem is when you have these multiple transparency reports, it actually becomes more confusing for
For
the
the
public.
public.
Because now there are these 2-3 different reports that are, the dimensions are completely different. You don't understand how they're comparable. It just adds confusion. If it was a single report, then it would actually be better in terms of transparency rather than worse.
Agreed. And then lastly, there's an initiative to eliminate aid for residentially placed students. We are opposing that. I know the school superintendents and the National School Board as well.
Where, is that an initiative in Albany?
So with that, I'm going to toss it over to Superintendent Russell.
Yes, so just to kind of put a summary on what was a really great and robust discussion, you'll see there the proposed tax levy and proposed budget to budget increases, as Denise referenced earlier. And as far as our thinking and our vision at this point, you'll see there, again, where we're looking to strike a balance between respecting the taxpayers of the community, understanding that we want to be able to say, here's the return on investment for us asking for additional taxpayer money for next year. We want it to also be about what new experiences we're able to offer to our kids and to our teachers. Summarizing some of the important upcoming dates, we referred to Budget Saturday several times. I understand there'll be Irish soda breath. So I look forward to that, as well as some great discussion. And we encourage all members of our community to visit us through any of those mechanisms for updates on the budget, to share your thoughts, questions, concerns, ideas related to the budget, the vision, and what we'd like to accomplish for kids in the upcoming schools. Of course, if there are any other questions, happy to hear those.
one other question, one thing you didn't talk about, and I assume we will talk about. Next month is vehicle proposition. Is it your expectation? I assume the answer is yes, that there will be some replacement that's gonna have to be done with regard to school buses and or other vehicles,
Yes.
and we'll hear about that.
Yeah, so I met with the transportation department and we are formulating those numbers as we speak. So we will bring that to the board on budget Saturday, if not before.
Is there anything else on budget Saturday that's not been covered in here or having to do with transportation that we would be expecting to see?
I think
Not that I
so.
can think of, no.
Except I'm sort of.
Not that I can
I don't think so.
Okay.
Special encore performance.
Mhm.
Any other questions? All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you so
This was a very robust presentation. I know we're all looking forward to Budget Saturday and being able to spend some time hearing more about some of these initiatives in detail. So we're looking forward to it. All right,
Can you just remind everyone when it begins?
7:45 a.m., March 19th. Please join us. We will, obviously, we'll be noticing the meeting, and we'll have further details on where that meeting will be held.
And will an agenda once again be produced so that the community, if they only want to hear a certain portion, like they can follow along and.
Yep, absolutely.
All right, well, if there's nothing else, then recommended action that the Board of Education adjourn at 10:08 p.m.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, abstain, motion carries. Thank you very much, everyone who's joining us on the live stream or watching the recording. And I hope everyone has a nice night. Good night, Omar.
Thanks.
Night, Omar.
Good night, Omar.
Stephen, Denise, thank you so much. Listen, the person that works in budgets, I know
Yeah.
the work that went